We're going to talk in this lecture about Raymond Cattell's work in the 16 personality factors. So Alpart, excuse me, as you learned from our last lecture, Gordon Alpart had tens of thousands of descriptive adjectives for personality. He and his colleagues went through the dictionary and identified every single word that they thought could describe a person. And then organize these into cardinal traits, central traits, and secondary traits. Cattell narrowed these even further using a process called factor analysis that we'll discuss in more detail in subsequent lecture. And he was able to take all of these traits and, using this statistical process, cluster them into 16 personality factors, or 16 PF. So he was, of course, in British. He worked as a school psychologist, even though that wasn't his main interest. He studied personality, for example, thinking about things like intelligence linked to social status and things like that. I eventually moved to the United States and moved to Harvard and lived right next door to Alpert, so they had this really nice collegiality. And were able to talk over these ideas, and that allowed Cattell to kind of build off of Alpart's original work. And what he's known for are his statistical approaches to personality. So a quote from Cattell, personality is that which permits a prediction of what a person will do in a given situation. So we've talked about personality as patterns of behavior. And this is sort of what we would predict. So if we could consider that we take person A and we expose them to a party, they'll respond in a certain way, and that certain way that they might respond would be identified as possibly a trait that would allow us to predict and foretell their behavior, systems of behavior within a person. Traits are that which defines what a person will do in a particular situation, or determinants of behavior. He used what we call triangulated measures, which you can basically think of as multi-methods approach, or using different types of data to understand a person. So he wanted to systematically describe individuals, but not use just one lens. He wanted to get several lenses. So we could find words to describe someone, but are those consistent with their behavior? So he had three types of data that he dealt with primarily. He had Q data, which is his shortened verb for questionnaire data, self-report, what a person says about themselves. We had T data, which is like test data, and these are objective tests where an individual taking the test might not know exactly what's being measured. So this might be like, say, the Big Five personality test, where different constructs are kind of hidden in items that are mixed up and presented in a different order. So that is thought to reveal maybe a more honest assessment of a personality, aside from what the person thinks of themselves. And then we want to see, is this consistent with L data, or life data, like school records, grade point average, driving record, and so forth. So in other words, if an individual takes a questionnaire and we ask them to what extent are you outgoing and extroverted, and do you enjoy being around other people, and they'll report on that data. And then perhaps we'll give them some sort of a test in which they are sort of embedded in the question, like embedded in the story that they tell, or embedded within their responses to questions about a story, is a subtle way of measuring the same trait of extroversion. And then what would we expect to see on their life data? We might expect to see a large number of friends if they're extroverted. We might expect to see school records showing a lot of involvement in extracurricular activities. And so now we'd have a triangulated approach, three different types of data. As another example, conscientiousness is another trait, referring to how responsible, how seriously a person takes their responsibilities and attends to the details of their life. And so we can ask them questions, and they can report on how seriously they take their responsibilities. That would be a direct response. we could give them some sort of a test that would measure conscientiousness, like a test that required them to attend to a lot of details in order to provide answers to questions. And that would provide us additional information on how conscientious they are. If they did well on this test, that suggests that they have a good capacity to attend to details and might be high in conscientiousness. And then we could look at life data, like do they pay their bills on time? How often were they late for school? And things like this might be life data that would also corroborate the self-report and test findings on a trait of conscientiousness. And those are called triangulated measures, using several data points to get at the same construct. He also sought patterns of personality that could be independently confirmed with these three types of data. He used a multivariate approach, meaning that he used many variables at once to predict behavior. So combining characteristics, not just using conscientiousness alone, but conscientiousness in combination with vigilance, in combination with some sort of attentiveness. We'll look at what they exactly are shortly. And he identified these as surface traits. These are items that correlate positively, meaning that as one aspect goes up, the other one also increases. But he's not sure they're a trait. They're like maybe temporary, transient, maybe more related to states than traits. Then source traits are robust correlation clusters. They appear repeatedly. They seem to be singly caused within personality. They're really strongly going together. And again, we'll look at factor analysis in more detail upcoming. And this is where he used a statistical approach, factor analysis, to search for these robust traits. And he identified 16 such personality factors, 16 multiple choice scales measuring one underlying source trait. So multiple choice, 185 questions, and then there were 16 factors that were identified through these, and the set of scores on all these factors is a profile. So we'll take a look at a couple of these profiles shortly, and as well as the 16 personality factors. So first off, he identified his factors as opposites, like introverted versus extroverted, and an individual might be up toward this extroverted side. Accommodating versus independent, so someone might be anywhere along this continuum. Receptive versus tough-minded. And you can see that the global factor is tough-mindedness, the global factor is independence, the global factor is self-control, and the opposites would be unrestrained versus self-controlled. And anxiety, another example, might have low anxiety or high anxiety. So those 5 global factors. You'll see later that these kind of connect with the big 5 that we'll talk about next. So there are primary factors that contribute to these global factors. So within extroversion, we have warmth, liveliness, social boldness, privateness, and self-reliance. And those are inverted. So these negative signs mean that these characteristics go in the opposite direction. So high in privateness would be low in extroversion, and the vice versa, whereas high in social boldness would also be high in extroversion. So, but these are the factors that seem to contribute to this trait of extroversion, which he defines as social orientation, the desire to be around others and be noticed by them, the energy invested in initiating and maintaining social relationships. You'll notice he gave letters to his traits, you see here under contributing primary factors. And this is primarily because he didn't want to create an impression by using these exact words when somebody would see these. So he wanted these to be a little more objective, and if you look at the letter F, you might react to it differently if you're analyzing data than if you're looking at liveliness. And so it removes bias just a bit. Independence, defined as the role a person assumes when interacting with others, the extent to which they are likely to influence or be influenced by the views of others, and the contributing primary factors are dominance, social boldness, vigilance, and openness to change, all positively correlated. Tough-mindedness is the way a person processes information, the extent to which they will solve problems at an objective cognitive level or by using subjective or personal considerations. So those are the opposites within there. And we have warmth inversely correlating with tough-mindedness, sensitivity inversely correlated. As sensitivity increases, tough-mindedness decreases, abstractedness inversely correlated, and openness to change inversely correlated. And these are the clusters that were revealed through the statistical process called factor analysis. Self-control is a dimension described as response to environmental controls on behavior or internal self-discipline. And it's inversely related to liveliness, positively related to rule consciousness. Abstractedness is inversely related, and perfectionism is positively related to self-control. And finally, anxiety, which is defined as emotional adjustment, the type of emotions experienced and the intensity of these. And so if one is high in emotional stability, meaning your emotions aren't fluctuating much, they're fairly stable, then you're low in anxiety, according to these measures. If you're high in vigilance, or attention to your surroundings, awareness, you're also high in anxiety. If you're high in apprehension, this is also a contributing factor to anxiety. And tension is the final contributing factor to anxiety. So these are all revealed through statistical processes. And so as such, because it's consistent across a large number of people, then we can then take these items, these 185 items that contribute to these primary factors and global factors, and use them to create profiles of individuals. So here's an example of such a profile. So you can see here these primary factors in their opposites. And you can see the different ratings on each of these, and from these ratings you can create a broader profile. So tolerates disorder versus perfectionistic, relaxed versus tense, forthright versus private. And so you can see this might be connected by a line to create a profile for this person that could then be used as a template to measure or to compare other similar people. So this is how it might work. So you have a profile that tends to be typical of pilots. For example, in this case, it's the green line, so that you can see airline pilots tend to be, fairly emotionally stable, high in self-control, relaxed as opposed to tense, self-assured as opposed to apprehensive, tough-minded as opposed to sensitive. These are all characteristics that are typical of airline pilots. So if you want to be an airline pilot, you might take the 16PF and see how does your profile, then we'd have a line that we draw that corresponded with your profile, and we could overlay it with this profile of the airline pilot to see how well you fit. And if your profile came up more like the red line does, well, you might not be well suited to a role of airline pilot. You're high in sensitivity. Oh, maybe you have to make decisions that aren't going to be well suited to that characteristic. You're very imaginative, but maybe an airline pilot is better off being practical. So this is how this profile might be used, and you can see it's kind of nice. We have a similar profile for artists and writers, and that profile is distinct from the profile for pilots as we would expect it to be. So it's sort of a nice measure, and again, we get a visual image that we can just overlay onto an existing template for a particular career, and it seems to be a beneficial tool. So to just summarize what we went through, these traits exist as measurable constructs within people that predict behavior over time. Allport identified many trait words and divided them into cardinal, secondary, and central traits. And then Cattell took that and used factor analysis, a statistical process, to develop the 16PF from which profiles are formed to predict suitedness for employment and other things.